Of the Edgenuity lesson, graphing sine and cosine. So to start off, I'm going to talk about the parent functions, which basically means it's just the most basic graph that you can have. So y equals sine of x. There's no shifts. There's nothing going on. It's just the plain sine graph. So on both sine and cosine, there are what I call 5 critical points. So for sine, the way it works is sine starts and ends at 0. Okay, so really quickly, let me back up here. This is what the sine graph looks like. Okay, this is one cycle. Because see, it starts at 0, goes up, down to its minimum, and then comes back to 0. If I were to extend my window here, it's just going to go up, down, forever and ever and ever. So when we graph, all we really need to graph is one side of the graph. You don't have to keep going up, down, up, down, up, down. So just those 5 critical points that I talked about. So like I said, your sine graph starts and ends at 0. And one cycle is 2 pi. So that's the period of the graph. It starts at 0, 0, and it ends at 2 pi where it's 0. So starts at 0, one period is 2 pi, ends at 0. Then for sine, exactly halfway in between at pi, you also have a 0. Okay, so when I set up my graph too, I usually do 2 spaces to go up to 1 and 2 spaces -1. And then when I do my x-axis, it's 2 spaces pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. So remember, this is like a half, 1, 1.5, 2. So here in between our first 2 zeros, you're going to hit your maximum, which is at 1. So I'm going to go halfway in between 0 and pi, up to 1. And then over here, between our second 2 zeros, we hit our minimum. So halfway in between pi and 2 pi, at 3 pi over 2, we're at -1. Then from there, you just connect all the dots. Nice, smooth, continuous curve. And that is what the sine graph looks like. Cosine has some similarities and some differences. So one period of your graph is also from 0 to 2 pi. The difference with cosine, instead of starting and ending at 0, you start and end at the maximum at 1. So start at 1. One period of the graph is 2 pi, so it ends at 1. Now on this one, halfway in between your 2 maximums at pi, you're going to be at your minimum down here at -1. So then there's 3 of our 5 critical points. So the other 2, halfway in between our maximum and our minimum, we're going to hit 0. Halfway between our maximum and our minimum over here, we also hit 0. So cosine starts up here, goes down, and back up. Okay, so those are the most basic. Like I said, the period goes from 0 to 2 pi. The amplitude is 1, meaning there's an imaginary 1 sitting in the front right there, but no other number to make it taller or shorter. So now let's look at it with an amplitude other than 1. So this number in the front tells you how high up your graph goes. So it doesn't always just go up to 1 or start at 1. Sometimes it might start at 2, 3, so on and so forth. And this number in the front will tell you that. So this graph has an amplitude of 2, and the period is still 2 pi. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, this is sine. So to start off, I'm going to put the basic graph on there so you can see what it looks like, and then I'm going to apply this shift here. So sine graph starts and ends at 0. So one period is 2 pi, start at 0, end at 0 at 2 pi. Halfway in between, we have another 0 at pi. Halfway in between these 2, we hit our maximum at pi over 2. And halfway in between these 2, we hit our minimum at 3 pi over 2. So since this isn't my final answer, I'm just going to dash it in. This is just plain old sine. Okay, so now I'm going to apply the shift. So now we have an amplitude of 2. So what that means is, instead of our maximum being at 1, it's up here at 2. So we are still starting and ending at 0. Halfway in between these two, we're at 0 still. That didn't change. But now, in between 0 and pi, at pi over 2, our maximum is up here at 2. And then similarly here, in between pi and 2 pi, halfway, our minimum is now -2 because of that number in the front. So if I fill it in, it just makes it taller. Okay, so now let's look at cosine. Okay, so this one has two things going on. This is -3 in the front, so that means we're going to have a reflection. It's negative, so we have to reflect it over the x-axis, and we also have an amplitude of 3 again. So when you find the amplitude, it's always a positive. So you take essentially the absolute value of that number. So our amplitude here is going to be 3. There's also a reflection, and our period is still 2 pi. That's not going to change until the next lesson. So just like I did in the other one, I'm going to put the basic cosine graph on there. So let me put in my values here. 3. Remember, I do 2 boxes for each on the y-axis and 2 boxes for the x-axis as well. 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi. Okay, so remember that cosine, the way that one goes, it starts and ends at the maximum. So we're going to start at 1, and over at 2 pi, when our period ends, we're going to end at 1. Halfway in between our two maximums, we hit our minimum, -1. Halfway between a maximum and a minimum, you have to go across the x-axis. There are zeros there. So halfway between those two. Okay, so again, I'm just going to dash it because it's not my final answer. Whenever I have a reflection, I usually do another dash graph and then change the amplitude from that. So what happens when you have a reflection, nothing happens with the zeros, because if you're reflecting over the x-axis, they're on the x-axis, so they're not going to change. What's going to happen is your maximums that were up at +1, they're going to flip down here to -1, and then your minimum -1 reflects over the x-axis to a +1. So what's going to happen here? These stay put. These two are going to come down and be negative. And this one's going to reflect up to become positive. So this, again, is not my final answer because I haven't done anything with the amplitude yet. Okay, so now that I have the graph reflected, now I'm going to change the amplitude to 3. So that means that instead of our maximum being 1, we're going to bump it all the way up here to 3. And our minimums, instead of being -1, we're going to move them all the way down to -3. So again, nothing's happening to those zeros. They just stay put at this point. This comes down to -3, down to -3, and then this maximum goes up to +3. So this one's really tall. There's that. Okay, the last one we're going to do here, it has a shift here at the end. So if there's a number in front, that changes how tall it is. That changes the amplitude. This one, we don't have one. So our amplitude is just 1. So we're going to keep it the same as the basic graph. There's no change to the period. Again, that's going to come in the next lesson. Now, if there's anything being added or subtracted at the end, that's in charge of moving your graph up or down. So since this says +3 at the end, I know that we're going to take our basic graph and shift it up 3. Okay, so cosine starts and ends at 1. Halfway in between, we hit our minimum, which is -1. In between your maximum and your minimum, you have your zeros. Minimum, maximum, you have your 0. Dash that in. Okay, so the only thing that changed, because our amplitude is still 1, we're just going to go up 3. So all 3 of these points, you have to move them up 3 spaces. 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. So it looks like this.